Well, let's do something. It says the same time we started getting it. We should have having fracking.
All right, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all very much for coming. We've got three panelists here today to talk about injection wells, and I'd like to take a moment before we start to talk about our group, COFIG.
Oh, thank you.
COFIG is a citizens group that we started back in, I think it was July of last year, basically to organize around the issue of fracking locally in Southeast Ohio, and to kind of assist in the education with regard especially to the environmental, economic, and the human health issues surrounding fracking. So that people can really start making sort of informed decisions about leasing their land, and we've brought in some lawyers to talk about the law with regard to oil and gas leasing, and also just safety and the technology of fracking itself. And we've had a lot of opportunity to talk about the oil and gas drilling process itself. But what we haven't been able to talk about much or think about nearly as much yet is injection wells, which are the other half of the process, and will store the fluid that comes out of a well after the drilling and the fracking actually takes place. So because we currently have a large number of injection wells in Ohio and are going to continue to see more, especially in our area, we want to draw upon the expertise and the experience of our panelists to learn a little bit more about injection wells and to kind of get some questions going. So each of them is going to give a presentation. We're going to be taking questions throughout the entire event, and then once all the presentations are done, we're going to be asking the questions of the panelists. So Jan, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce them.
My name is Jan Adams, and I think Dylan forgot to introduce himself. Dylan Rees. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our panelists before they start. And our first panelist will be Pavon Pettigrew. She's the lady in green there. She earned an associate degree in applied science from West Virginia University, a bachelor's degree in biology and geology from Marietta College, and a master's of science in environmental studies from the University of Charleston. If that didn't keep her busy, I also know that she earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in viola performance from the Charleston Conservatory of Music and Fine Arts, a mix of science and music. She has worked in several laboratory and field service positions and served as a senior geologist with the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection in Charleston for 17 years. First in Hydrologic Protection Unit of the Division of Mining and Reclamation, and then in Groundwater Protection Unit of the Division of Water and Waste Management, where she developed and administered the Underground Injection Control Program for coal mining. Presently, Ms. Pettigrew resides in Parkersburg and teaches geology, physics, and physical science at West Virginia University at Parkersburg, and is the owner of P.L. Pettigrew Consulting. So you have 15 minutes or so, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Microphone. Mike. Thank you. I want to talk to you a little bit about the part of underground injection that has occasionally been proposed that would involve injecting into abandoned mine voids as opposed to into patent rock. Normally when you think of underground injection, you picture a pressurized well going into a rock layer, forcing the substance into the rock. But it hasn't gone unnoticed by the extraction industries that abandoned coal mines represent huge voids, and by huge I mean you can't begin to imagine, covering thousands and thousands of miles underground and often in multiple layers, where you can put things and they'll be out of sight and hopefully out of mind. For many years with the DEP, that's what I had to deal with, mostly in regard to coal mines, although I did have an occasional aberration of something that was not a coal mine wanting to inject into a coal mine. And one of the reasons why I'm presenting this tonight is because before I retired from the DEP, I was approached informally by representatives from certain oil and gas production companies who inquired if it might be feasible for them to get permits to inject frac fluids into these underground coal voids. And it had to come through me because that was my program. Anything that went into a coal mine was my program, so this is the first time I'd had to deal with them, the first time they'd had to deal with me. And I told them truthfully, yes, you can get permits to do that, but you will be under the same onus that coal companies are if they want to inject preparation plant slurry or pond decant or whatever it is they're wanting to put underground. They said, well, what is that? I said, number one is full disclosure. Nobody gets a permit without declaring every single solitary chemical that will come in contact with the process that produces the injecting. No ifs, ands, or buts. And you can't use anything that would be considered a hazardous waste under RCRA. And there are limits to how much volume that you can do. And there has to be certain other things. When they heard all of that, they rode away sorrowing because they knew that they did not want to try to get a Class 5 well from the state of West Virginia. A few months later, before I retired, I was approached by some of the regulators from the Office of Oil and Gas at the DEP, and they asked me the same question. Apparently, people had approached them and said, hey, can you talk to the Class 5 people and see if you can get us some wells because we need a place to put these enormous volumes of discarded fluids. And I told the people from the oil and gas department the same thing. I said, you know, nobody gets a free pass. You have to abide by the same rules that coal companies have to abide by, and these are the rules. And once again, it went away. And I thought I was done with it. Let's see if I can just roll. That's, in case you haven't seen one, that's a typical underground injection well that goes into an abandoned mine. It's usually just a pipe. As I said earlier, typically they don't inject under pressure. Sometimes there will be pressure involved if they have to pump the fluid up a grade. But once it gets to the injection point, it generally falls by gravity feed into the mine. And that's a good thing. You don't have to worry about pressurization, annular seals, mechanical integrity tests, and that sort of thing. But it also can be a bad thing. And I'll show you some more. That's even more typical. The thing about injection wells, whether they're on a coal mine site or whether they're on a drilling site or associated with drilling, they're very hard to find. A well is a very small thing in the great cosmic scheme. And as you can see, this is just a pipe. And they put a little cage around it to keep large things from plugging it off. That was right beside the road. So, you know, if anybody wanted to throw a dead animal in there or, you know, dump a barrel of used oil, there was nobody to stop them. There was pretty much nobody around. No state, including West Virginia or Ohio, could ever afford enough inspectors to cover all of these sites and find every well and be out there every day checking on it to make sure that everything's done right. So there has to be as strict control as possible on the wells if you're going to use them. Underground, there's not anything terribly sophisticated about a Class 5 well. As I said earlier, you don't have an annular seal. You don't have mechanical integrity testing like you would with a pressurized well. Basically, you just have some casing. And when it gets to the bottom, which is a coal seam, this is just a void. It's like a big room. And you just pour the stuff down there, and it can flow at a pretty great rate. I had, during my tenure with DEP, I had some permits that were injecting 2 to 3 million gallons a day through these wells. But this was not fracking fluid. These were prep plant slurry injection wells. Underground injection wells are regulated by the federal government, above all, the federal government. Now, other states, including Ohio and West Virginia, can obtain primacy. Primacy means that that state has received written permission from the US EPA to run their own program, to do their own enforcement. In order to have primacy, that state's laws and regs have to be as stringent or more stringent than those of the federal EPA. It takes years to get primacy. You have to present a package that is often that thick with proof that you're going to do what you say you're going to do. Some states have partial primacy. It depends on how much they've been able to achieve. Some states are regulated entirely by the US EPA, but we're talking about Ohio and West Virginia here. In Ohio, Ohio has almost everything in primacy, with the exception of Class 6 wells, which are still with the US EPA. A Class 6 well is the underground injection and sequestration of carbon dioxide. This is a real new category. At the time I retired, there were only 5 classes. And the first geologic sequestration permit that was written as a Class 5 permit in my program before I left. But now there is Class 6, and I dare say probably Ohio will have primacy in that before too much longer. But keep in mind what I'm saying about primacy, because that comes up later. By the way, Class 4 wells are illegal throughout the United States now. They still exist on the books because once upon a time they were legal, but there are no more Class 4 wells. A Class 4 well receives hazardous waste at a shallow injection level, which means it can get into water supplies. So very wisely, US EPA outlawed them across the board, across the United States, all the territories and the Indian tribes. I'm talking tonight primarily about Class 5 wells. A Class 5 well is, by definition, a shallow well. They rarely go as deep as 1,000 feet, usually just a few hundred. And by definition, a Class 5 well receives non-hazardous waste. And that's non-hazardous by definition from RCRA. But these agencies that have primacy are charged with protecting existing and potential drinking water sources, and all groundwater should be regarded as existing or potential drinking water, because what right now maybe isn't being used as a drinking water source, we may have to in the future. So it's important that no one uses the excuse, well, nobody's drinking out of it, so let's just put anything in it we want. We might wish that we had not done that. Class 5 wells convey fluids into abandoned underground mine voids. More often than not, a Class 5 well will be carrying slurry, which is the discharge from a coal preparation plant where the coal is sized and washed, or sludge, which is what's left in a pond after acid mine drainage has been treated. You have to do something with the semi-solid fluid that's left in the pond, because the ponds have to be at 60% capacity or better at all times. Generally speaking, that's just semantics. Slurry and sludge look a lot alike. But tonight we're talking about waste fracking fluids, and this is something that we hadn't really thought about before now. The injection of fracking fluids into abandoned coal mines differs from other underground injection because the material is not forced, as I said earlier, into the rock, but it gravity feeds. The wells are not subjected to integrity testing. They don't really have to be, since they're not pressurized. And the number of wells per mine is almost limitless. The point behind that is, if someone wants to get a permit and they put 75 wells on that permit in the space of, let's say, 25 acres, there's no reason why they can't do it. And there's a couple of very good reasons to do it. One of them is if there's a lot of solids in it, as that flows down through the pipe, they will build up below the pipe, come up to the bottom of it, plug it off, and that well isn't useful anymore, so they need to move on to another. And that happens a lot in coal, and it can happen with fracking. Also, if you have a really large amount of fluid to get rid of, the more wells, the merrier. I think I've done something. Yep. Any underground injection waste materials presents 2 primary concerns, and as you deal with this problem, and I gather that all of you care about this problem or you wouldn't be here, please keep these 2 items in mind at all times, because there's a lot of detail and confusion out there. But the 2 most important things always are quantity, the amount that's going underground, and quality, the chemical or biological constituents of what's going underground. The quantity issue involves volume limits, and with Class 5 wells, it's very rare that a permit would set limits at the point of injection. For one thing, it's just plain labor intensive to have to measure Okay, you're only allowed to inject 750,000 gallons today, and you injected 750,001, so you're out of compliance. That really doesn't work very well. So UIC permits for anything going into a mine void, generally speaking, will set the limit not on how much goes down the pipe per day, but on what the eventual hydrostatic head is going to be in the mine. That's extremely important. That's more important than any other number as far as quantity goes, is how deep is this water going to go in that mine void? And there's a lot of reasons for it. Overfilling of mine voids can result in blowouts and flooding, and that can kill many people. There's a place in West Virginia where if the mine is not kept pumped down 24 hours a day, pumped into the Monongahela River, it will blow out at a place called, are you ready, Buffalo Creek in Fairmont. And if it does, it's going to wipe out a lot of people. So that's a very serious consideration. You have to keep the hydrostatic head below a certain level or it will do something awful. Sudden catastrophic subsidence, even if it blows out somewhere that it doesn't drown anybody, the sudden drop in hydrostatic head underground can cause a collapse above ground. And if you could see the amount of water that lies under Ohio, under West Virginia, Ohio, and up into Pennsylvania in sort of a hot sideways horseshoe in the old Pittsburgh mine seams. If that thing would ever blow out, there would be several cities that would sink. So it's extremely important that you don't overfill the mine and cause it to suddenly lose its capacity to hold everything up. Also, and this is very important, the intermingling with aquifers. It may be that if it gets to a certain level, that water will come in contact with fractures or fissures or an aquifer, and now whatever's in that water is going to be traveling to possibly somebody's drinking water well, maybe even a municipality's drinking water source. And of course, seeps and contamination can come to the surface even if it doesn't affect anybody's immediate drinking water. A lot of the stuff that's in those mines would be deadly to the biota of stream life, such as caddisflies, mayflies, fish reproductive areas. You can lose a lot of natural life that would be the bottom of the food chain if some of this stuff gets out. And one of the reasons for this is the laws that govern what goes underground are very different from the laws that govern what goes out into surface water, and for very good reason. And one of the things is that which goes out into surface water can affect life. The quality issue, and this is the one issue that I think right now might be the biggest problem in Ohio, because Ohio is proposing to do a lot of underground injection. Historically, they've been able, meaning any kind of extractive industry, have been able to put anything underground that they want and not account for how much or what's in it. They still want to do that. This is absolutely 100% unacceptable. If we can't have full disclosure using MSDS, here I talk about the mighty MSDS, the Material Safety Data Sheet. For every chemical that they use, they need to present an MSDS which describes the toxicity, lack thereof of the chemical, and legally the liability for the truthfulness of that statement lies with the manufacturer, because nobody else really has the ability to do that. So it's in their best interest to tell the truth. Is this a RCRA hazardous waste or not? If it's used as a potable water supply, don't inject anything into it. In all other cases, the mine should be considered potential water, so you don't want to poison it beyond use. Therefore, the proposed injection material, which is called the inject aid, must be able to meet federal safe drinking water standards, and I'm not making that up, that's federal law. And it should be Ohio law. If it isn't, I don't know why Ohio has primacy. We can do this. We can have extractive industries. I'm not here to put anybody out of business, but if they don't behave with responsibility to the people who live here, then maybe they shouldn't operate. It's not all black or all white. Can you operate responsibly? Will you operate responsibly? Will you work with people? And not poisonous, please. But there's a lot of bull out there, a lot of it. And as proof, my last slide, Thank you.
Who's in the center. Ms. Young is an 8th-generation Appalachian who became an activist after moving to her family's land in rural Meigs County in the year 2000. She discovered a disproportionate number of friends and neighbors who were sick or dying from cancer and respiratory illnesses. In looking for answers, she learned that her community was at the center of the second-largest concentration of coal-fired power plants in the nation. When she learned there were 5 additional power plants proposed in the immediately surrounding area, she formed a volunteer community group called Meigs Citizen Action Now. In 2006, she received an International Women's Award from the Women of Peace Power Foundation for her community organizing efforts about the costs inherent to coal production and consumption. She has been recognized by the Ohio Valley Environmental Coalition for her work against mountaintop removal and received the 2011 Social Justice Award from Athens County University Campus Ministries. She currently serves as a board member of the Buckeye Forest Council, works as a paralegal on oil and gas issues, and has been teaching workshops on navigating the ODNR to educate other Ohioans about how to gain access to information about injection wells and other polluting industries in their own communities. Elisa?
Hello. Oh, microphone. Okay, okay. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I found out about injection wells. I'm not going to talk anything at all about fracking because I've always been a community activist, and what is affecting my community right now is the injection wells. And I'm really deeply concerned with what I've found out so far. I'm also really deeply concerned how difficult it is to get access to the information and to the records that should be public. If there isn't any problem with this, why is the Department of Natural Resources being so secretive about what we should have access to? So I'll tell you a little bit about what I've been going through, just trying to find out more information about what they're hauling into our communities and injecting wholesale. I brought along a list that I had asked the ODNR to provide to me last winter, because I just wanted to get an idea of how many of these things are out there. We became concerned the end of the year last year, because the brine hauling was just incredible. I'd never seen trucks coming through like this day and night, nonstop, keeping people awake at night. And one of the myths is that what they're hauling in here is just brine. What they're hauling into our communities is very different, both in terms of volume and in terms of content, which you heard Pavan talk about. Because of the process, it's more radioactive, and the Ohio Department of Health, to my knowledge, still has not taken responsibility to test it properly, have they? There have been a lot of citizens pushing them to do that, because there are things called T-norms, technologically enhanced, normally occurring radioactive materials that are more highly concentrated. When they inject the fluid into the ground, it comes back up with a lot more than what it went down with, even aside from the chemicals that are used for this process. So my concern was not just with the content, which our state has never tested. Ohio has never tested the content of the fracking waste. They'll tell you they've tested brine, and they have, but they haven't tested this fracking waste. We've been doing public records requests, which, if there were records, they should have disclosed to us. We've been doing this since last winter, and they cannot produce one single document and have flat out told us, we have never tested this. And under the Ohio Revised Code, they have the authority to do this. And so if citizens are raising concerns, and they have the authority, and they have the technology, why aren't they testing it if there's really nothing wrong with it? And I think it's far too easy for our regulatory agencies to say there's nothing wrong with this stuff, when they're not testing it and they're not enforcing the rules that they should be. What Pavan said about primacy is absolutely true. We have made our own rules in our state, and what I'm troubled by is it seems to just keep evolving as things go. They are supposed to, for instance, do mechanical integrity testing. They will tell you that there are no leaks. They'll tell you that there are no leaks. The only testing that they are supposed to do is this mechanical integrity testing, where they basically inject it under pressure and they monitor it to see, is it leaking out? And the casings that line these can be damaged over time. And a lot of these old wells are old. They're not all built to the new construction standards that they're in the process of developing. And for instance, in my county, we have 4 active injection wells. They want to put in 2 more. One would be a conversion well, which would be an old well made into another injection well. And the other one would be a new drill, which happens to be fairly close to our public drinking water supply, which really concerns me. If you're from Marietta, you've probably heard C8, right? You guys know what C8 is from DuPont, okay? Well, our public drinking water supply was poisoned by this chemical when DuPont was releasing it farther away from our drinking water wells than what this new injection well would be. And it was not under pressure. And the reason that our public water district could not protect us is because DuPont refused to release, even when they were asked, what chemicals they were releasing. And they were unregulated, so they weren't really required to. Now, they're going to tell you that this stuff is very highly regulated, but they're not disclosing to us exactly what these chemicals are. They may disclose a category and say, well, we've used a solvent, or we've used this, or we've used that, which is a general category. But they're not telling us specifically what we need to test for to see if there's stuff leaking out into our water so that we can take responsibility for what the Department of Natural Resources is not doing through the regulatory and the enforcement process. And if they're not even doing mechanical integrity testing every 5 years, as they're required to by the EPA, we don't even know if this stuff is leaking into our water aquifer, because it has to go through those casings. You cannot do hydraulic fracturing, you cannot do these injection wells without going through that. And those casings are what are supposed to protect us. So if they're not testing this to see if it's leaking, it's very easy for them to say there are no problems. It's kind of like saying there's nothing under that rock, they're not lifting it up. And we can pass this around. I started to print this out, and I thought it printed the entire thing, but unfortunately it only got to the P's. We have 177 active injection wells in the state. It's over 170. And I put a little check mark by these. And we can pass this around and you can look at it, just even what did print out. And I want you to keep in mind that they're supposed to test every 5 years to see if these things are leaking. The very first one, the last test was in 1978. I hadn't even graduated from high school. I'm 50 years old, for pity's sakes. They've been injecting all of this time, and they're not complying with federal law. And, 177? 77 that have not had mechanical integrity testing. The more you look, the scarier this is. And so, at any rate, if we want to pass this around to where people can take a look, and I'll forward the information. If you guys haven't signed up on a sign-in sheet for COFIG, I can forward this information very easily to them. And if you want it, we can make it accessible. This is the Department of Natural Resources' own information. This isn't something that I pulled off or would have transposed any numbers. This is the sheet that they go by. To protect us, they should go every 5 years. This is what they're doing, okay? And so I guess we don't have a whole lot of time, but I would like to address just a couple of things that I'm finding don't ring true. They're saying that Ohio is the best regulated state in the nation. So I decided to go down to West Virginia, who's also under primacy, and look at it and see how do we stack up to them. Do you know that the state of West Virginia requires testing of the content of the injectate before they issue a permit? It's actually a permitting requirement for every single well, whether it's a commercial well that accepts it from multiple sites and they're all using different chemical compounds. And throughout the life of the permit. Ohio has never tested it once. Now let me ask you, why are we getting so much West Virginia waste? I mean, if I were a hauler, if I were an operator, and I knew that they were going to test it in West Virginia, and I knew they'd never tested it once in Ohio, where do you think I'd get in my truck and go? We are not the best regulated state in the nation, and it's time that we started challenging this and looking at it. The problem is that we don't have access to the information. It's very difficult to find it. And I'm not claiming to be an expert, but I will share with you what I know and what I have found in my own search to try and find the truth. And I'll tell you, there are a million different points we could look at, but those are just two. We are not living up to the standards that need to happen, even to meet the most basic minimal standards. Again, no water contamination. How can they assure us that there's been no water contamination if they're not testing for leaks? And they're not even telling us what's in the content of it so that we can test for ourselves. And it can be really expensive to start doing this kind of testing. What I've seen with Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 that they're going to tell you about, the ecologists that I work with and that I've talked to said you don't even start with Tier 1 and Tier 2. You need to immediately